Okay. Welcome everybody. My name is Taylor Owen. I'm a professor of public policy at McGill University and the director of the Center for Media, Technology, and Democracy. So Emily and I were sort of talking a bit about this online harms bill as it came out and thinking it might be fun, helpful, productive over the next few weeks to host a series of conversations about it with a number of the people who have been a part of the discussion about this pretty sweeping piece of legislation that is going to be the subject of a fair amount of conversation in this country, as it should be over the coming months. And we thought, what better way to start this than to bring some of the group back together that participated in the federal government's online safety expert panel last year. Many will remember that after a couple of false starts by the federal government and then some other potential proposals and paths for online harms legislation, they convened an expert panel to spend a series of months looking into all aspects of this legislation, the approach, comparisons with other jurisdictions. And so everybody here on this call was on that panel, and we thought it might be interesting to get everybody's reflections on what ultimately ended up in the bill, how this merges with some of the conversations we had and what we collectively think, individually and collectively think about what's been proposed by the government. So that's our intention. Emily, who's here with me, is the Canada Research Chair in Cybersecurity Law at the University of Calgary. Amarnath is the assistant professor in the School of Religion and the Department of Political Studies at Queen's. Heidi is the Canada Research Chair in International History and Public Policy at UBC. And Vivek, when the panel was happening, was at the University of Ottawa, but is now an associate professor at University of Colorado Law School. So welcome, everybody. I think first off, our plan here is Emily's going to give a little bit of background on what is in the bill. And then we'll go around the group, get some initial thoughts from the first week of this conversation, what we've seen in the bill, what is and isn't in it, and then we'll have a bit of a wider conversation. So welcome, everybody. We're really excited you're here. It's nice to have the band back together, as we were saying earlier in email, and I'm looking forward to hearing what everybody thinks about this pretty consequential piece of legislation that we now have out in public. Emily, would you like to kick us off and just give us a little rundown so everybody's on the same table, what's in this, and what we're going to talk about today?
Yes, and I'm going to keep this very, very, very short so that we can get into the fun discussion. But with the online harms bill being tabled Monday, what we saw was that 7 types of harmful content are proposed to be regulated. It would be child sexual abuse content, content that bullies a child, content that induces a child to harm themselves. So those are the more like child protection focused types of harm. And then also content that incites violent extremism or terrorism, incites violence, or foments hatred. And then the 7th category is for intimate image abuse, non-consensual sharing of intimate images, and that includes deep fakes. So the proposal is the creation of this body, which would be the commission that investigates, and the ombudsperson, which would be kind of a victim resource, both supported by the idea of this digital services office. Interestingly, what is regulated will be social media services, so communications that can be between individuals that are accessible by the public. Excluded would be private messaging, gaming, search engines. And what's proposed is this graduated scheme where that idea of duty to act responsibly that our panel talked a lot about, which would impose risk management obligations, it would apply to all types of harmful content. So filing digital safety plans, best practices, stronger obligations when it comes to children to protect them. So the idea of really safety by design at the forefront. And then a third category, which is the one where content removal can happen, and that would be for things like child exploitation material and intimate images. There are also some amendments to the Criminal Code and the Canada Human Rights Act. They have attracted a lot of attention in the news and controversy because our panel has been was mostly focused on the platform regulation aspect of this. That will be more of the focus of this panel, but of course, if anyone here wants to talk about that, I invite you to do so. But I think that at least kickstarts us about getting things going. And maybe I can turn to Heidi first. Of just, what are you happy with it? What are your takes with the legislation?
Yeah, thank you, Emily and Taylor, for bringing us all together and for a discussion. And as you say, I think this is the beginning of what's going to be quite a lot of discussion around this bill, and rightly so, because it's a very complex bill with multiple moving parts. So maybe I'll just say three things to kick us off. One is that I think when you look at the online harms part of this bill, I recognize a lot of things that came from our expert panels discussions, which I think is just important to lay out. So things that we talked a lot about, whether it was duty to act responsibly or trying to make sure that takedowns are not the focus of a bill, that the focus is on things like the systems and processes that companies have, talking about digital safety plans. And maybe I'll just say as a background for people on the call that the expert advisory group was not charged with coming to any consensus. We didn't deliver recommendations that all 12 of us signed off on. But nevertheless, through the process, even though lots of us had very different takes at the beginning, we did come to actually quite a lot of consensus about things like a focus on systems and processes. And I think you see a lot of that actually reflected in the bill. And that's not always the way that these things work out. So I just think that's actually a really important point. And at least for me, made me feel that the time we invested, which was considerable, was very much worthwhile in trying to ensure that this is a bill that's informed by the latest research as we have it on these platforms, how they function, how we can best protect freedom of expression, while also taking into account child safety and so on and so forth. And I think there's still, we can have more debate about whether there are bits we would nuance, tweak in different ways. But anyway, that's the first point I would say, is that you can see a lot of our expert advice and our discussions reflecting this bill, even though at the time we were a panel, this was under the auspices of the Heritage Ministry, and the bill was then taken on by the Justice Ministry. The second thing that I would say is that this is, though, a very complex bill, and a lot of the discussion that we've seen in the media or commentary has often picked up on one part, sort of said, oh, this is, censorship, et cetera, but partly due to picking up on one part and not seeing its full complexity. And that's a challenge because this is a bill that affects anyone who's going online. And so I think trying to figure out how does one actually make the complexity of this clear is going to be a real challenge. And I'll just take one example, which is the complaints mechanisms, is I think not necessarily clear to a lot of people who are reading this bill. It's not clear where you as an ordinary Canadian will go. And that's going to be, I think, a big part of the discussion, is how, if and when this gets implemented, is it actually going to be really clear if you are dissatisfied or you think that there is some reason to go to the Ombudsperson or the Digital Safety Commission or the Human Rights Commission? How are you going to know which one you're supposed to go to, and how are you going to make this process accessible? If there's going to be this fairly unique idea of the Ombudsperson, how are we going to ensure people know when they should be turning to them or not? And then the third thing I'd say that I think is a really important pillar of this bill is the part about transparency and data access. Even now we see that Meta's own oversight board cannot get data from Meta to see whether their recommendations are being implemented. So the idea that we need to have transparency and data access embedded in a bill remains tremendously important. Now we've seen that oversight boards set up by companies don't work in terms of marking their own homework. They can't even mark their own homework, right? So having these kinds of provisions is, I think, incredibly important to know whether companies are actually enacting their own digital safety plans. So I'll leave it there, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, that's great, Heidi. I'll hold off on jumping in here because I really want to hear from Amarnath.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with a lot of what's been said so far. I think it's interesting to hear some of the public conversation so far, because I think a lot of people want legislation like this to solve all the world's problems, and there is a sense that there are limitations in the bill, but I think most reasonable people know that this kind of legislation isn't going to get rid of hate and extremism and all of this stuff in the online space. But I'm really glad we have something to kind of start the debate and start the conversation collectively, because it's better than not having anything. So that's part of the good sign. I think part of what's going to engage the public going forward is these companies, whether these companies are going to comply with any of these recommendations going forward. But I think companies are now much more used to global regulation and having to deal with it based on what other countries are doing. So I do think the way in which this bill is laid out, you could get some buy-in from some of these companies, and so that's also a good thing. I think in terms of criticism, I think some of the public debate going forward is going to be on who is watching the commission, and because there is this issue of a lot of power being given to a handful of people in the bill, and whether someone is monitoring what they're doing it is going to be, I think, an important part of the conversation going forward. The other thing I've seen and which I'm kind of happy with, but I also see points of criticism, is it leaves largely the algorithms untouched, and I think that's going to it's probably a good thing in the sense of in being able to get the bill actually passed, but at the same time it kind of leaves the elephant in the room kind of unaddressed, right? And so I think that's an important thing going forward to have a conversation about. Relatedly, I'll say the way in which it defines hate and extremism is also a bit narrow. I think looking at where the landscape of hate speech and extremism is going these days, it's still very much limited to kind of people who are protected under the Human Rights Act, whereas I think a lot of what we're seeing now is hate against non-protected individuals, right? So journalists, politicians, healthcare providers, and so a lot of that it isn't in the bill and won't be covered under, I think, who is protected by the bill. There's also this kind of focus on incitement of violence, which I think misses a bit of what happens in the online space, whereas it's not often overt incitement. It's just kind of generalized extremism that a lot of companies have been dealing with. So I'll leave it there, but I think overall I'm quite happy that there is a bill, and I'm happy with most of what's discussed in the bill. But I do think there'll be some debate going forward and some challenges, I think, in moving it through the political process.
Yeah, a lot to dig into there. So hopefully we can circle back. And Vivek.
Thank you, Taylor and Emily, for having me as the fifth foreign beetle in this band today. It's great to be here. So I largely agree with everything that Heidi and Amarnath said. I think there's a lot to like in this bill, but there are a few problems. So just first, in terms of the good, I think framing this bill in terms of duties is something that we spent a lot of time in the expert panel thinking about. We had consensus on that. And I'm glad to see that that's how the bill has been structured, right? So not, as you mentioned, Emily, as a content takedown sort of bill, but rather a duty to act responsibly and to mitigate harm, right? And sort of pretty sophisticated understanding of what are the kinds of mitigations we want to see, with accountability and transparency built in. So that's all great. But scope is limited, right? It's limited to 7 kinds of harm. So this is very different from the European DSA, which looks at, asks platforms to look at their systemic risks, right? Which is a much wider set of issues. So, for example, information integrity is really not in the scope of this bill, and that's a political choice. Is that right or wrong? It just is. I think that's worth thinking about. I think it was wise of the government to narrow this to platforms that are, and the platform functions of a multi-headed website like, a service like Facebook or X or whatever else, right? That the messaging is clearly excluded. So I think that's also a good thing. One other interesting thing that I picked up on is that child is actually defined in this law, which has interesting ramifications for the debate on C-27, where I've been a critic of the fact that the government hasn't done enough to protect the privacy of children. So I wonder if there'll be a knock-on effect there. On the indifferent, I would say, there are a lot of new bureaucracies created by this bill. And one of the interesting things for me is that there's a lack of clarity as to the relationship between these things, especially the ombuds and the commission. That's left completely undefined. And there's also a lack of clarity on how these new bureaucracies interact with other players in the digital regulatory space, notably the CRTC, the Privacy Commissioner, the Human Rights Commission, and others. And I think there's also a missed opportunity to draw upon the expertise of other parts of government in dealing with some of these issues. So one thing that struck me was that the Tri-Council that administers research funding for most Canadian academics is nowhere to be seen in the research provisions of this bill. And I think that's actually quite an important safeguard. Research access is great, but Cambridge Analytica was a research scandal. And I think we need very careful protections, both as to what uses get made of the data, but also as to the ethical, is this ethical research that we want to promote or not? So I think that's something that I'd love to see addressed. Now for the not so great. And I'm going to put my lawyer hat on. So I think the combination of informality of process at the commission with pretty serious penalties is a problem. And there's also inflation is in the air. And boy, every bill chooses a higher number for penalties, right? The GDPR was 4% of global revenue. C-27, 5%. Now we're at 6, 7, and 8%. So I guess this is how the government signals that it's really, really serious about something, is by escalating the maximum penalty. But that's serious money. And I think the informality of process, the lack of rules of evidence and process and procedure in the commission is going to be a problem. So I think that's something to think about in the hearing process. But the other thing that struck me are the inspection provisions. Inspectors in the employ of the commission have the power to basically conduct midnight raids, to access any document or system amongst regulated entities, not just for the purpose of investigating non-compliance, but to verify compliance. Now, I think that's very problematic given the sensitivity of the data that these companies handle without any kind of procedural check. There's no warrant requirement, there's no court order requirement, there's no judicial supervision, right? There's no threshold to say that, oh, we have a reasonable suspicion that something bad has happened, nor any protections for the privacy of personal information when it comes to those inspection provisions. And this is something we see in many other statutes, but I think it's particularly problematic in this issue space. So I'll leave it there. One last thought is that as good as the online harms bill is in general, I'm very concerned that the joinder of the Criminal Code and Human Rights Act amendments may be a poison pill. I'm of the view that some of those provisions are ill-considered, but maybe we'll get back to that later.
Yes, the poison pill issue definitely is. I think that could create a major problem here when it comes to those criminal code provisions and human rights provisions. And we had caution against poison pills, didn't we, as part of that panel, but in other contexts. When we were thinking about issues of disinformation and misinformation. Taylor, maybe I'll jump to you. Like, anything you want to add on here? Some quick takes.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, already just so much to dig into. I have like 10 questions for each of you. So like I'm looking forward to this conversation. But like a couple broad observations. I mean, one, I think it's interesting that in the obligations for different types of content, and Emily and I mentioned this in an article we did in the Globe today, that they balance free expression versus protection provisions differently for different types of content. And that's somewhat unique, I think, in that it's merging different approaches to balancing those two rights, ultimately, and charter rights in Canada. So for the harmful content, really companies just have that duty to act responsibly, right? So it's a reporting and transparency and accountability responsibility. For kids, it's ramped up a little bit, where companies will have to follow a design code. So there'll be kind of explicit criteria they will have to follow. They won't be able to choose their own criteria and just report on them. So it's a little more stringent for content seen or likely to be seen by children. And then for the two types of content, non-consensual intimate images and child sexual abuse material, there's highly restrictive rules, and the balance is very much towards protection and against free expression, with a mandatory takedown on those two. So I think that it just shows a bit of a nuanced breakdown of different content types requiring different balances between freedom and protection. So that's sort of one point that I think is positive and a good advance in how we're talking about these sort of regimes in other countries too. And the second point I make is that it's very clear they picked models from different countries, different other experiences. And this is something we really focused on in the expert panel conversations, which was, what did other countries get right and wrong in building out similar regulatory regimes? I mean, it's very clear to me that risk assessments and transparency mechanisms have an origin in the DSA, that the risk mitigation strategies are very similar to the codes of practice in the Online Safety Act, the regulatory powers that are given to the commission. And I agree with you, Vivek. I think we need to talk about like how much of those powers need to be defined much more carefully or specifically. But a lot of those powers are similar to Ofcom's. So I think like that, it comes from that as a regulatory model. And the notice and takedown on limited content types clearly comes from the safety commissioner in Australia. So I think if what we were asking as sort of a research community or people studying this were to take some lessons from what's worked in other contexts and listen to the experience and understand the experience of others, I think some of that is reflected here. And there's final thing I'll say is there are a couple new interesting things and such just smaller details hidden through. I mean, it's a sweeping bill. I mean, there's a lot in here, right? And there's a lot of focus been on the regulatory requirement through the commission structure and the new amendments. But there's a lot of detail in here. Like I thought the requirement to label automated content is interesting. I mean, I haven't seen that anywhere else. And that's essentially bot identification or mandatory AI identification potentially, or it could be interpreted as mandatory inauthentic amplification or inauthentic bot-driven amplification, right? So like that is kind of interesting. And as Emily mentioned at the top, the deepfakes being included in non-consensual intimate image provisions is interesting. I mean, I think it shows that this is like a bill that was written in a time of generative AI, not just platform distribution of content. So I think that's interesting. The final thing I'll say, and I'd like to come back to this to talk about more broadly, is as Heidi mentioned, the transparency requirements here are significant, and there's very little detail on how that's going to work. And as someone who works in that space and runs a research lab that would love some of this data and would love to be a part of understanding the harms that the commission are tasked with mitigating and holding accountable, it's totally unclear how that's going to work. And we've seen just time and time again in other jurisdictions that it's been incredibly difficult to anonymize these data, to get central depositories of it, to figure out who gets it and who doesn't. Interestingly, in this bill, it doesn't include just researchers. It also includes potentially civil society groups being tasked with this access. And that's interesting too, and a little more in line with the DSA. So anyways, I think there's a ton of detail that needs to be talked through about how that mechanism will work. But okay, that's not for me. Emily, your turn.
Yeah, so and I'll just maybe add a few points here because I found it interesting everything that everyone was saying, and maybe with the limited scope, I'll talk about that for a second because I've been You know, one thing that maybe is important, and Vivek had pointed this out, is that this actually is narrower than the Digital Services Act. It's narrower than what the UK has done there. And I remember even with some reluctance saying, you know, my advice had been be willing to be more narrow about that. And one of the things about Canada that I think where we're at right now that is so unique is you look at somewhere like Europe where they've had platform liability laws for, you know, 25 years. So there was something to build a more sophisticated framework on with the DSA, where in Canada, we've really only had intermediary liability in civil law and defamation or specific provisions in copyright. And so this really is something much more new here in Canada. And I think a narrower scope too, maybe actually speaking to the realities of regulatory body. I do think that the fact that the power to order content removal is with the commission for those narrow sets of content is really important. I mean, we really are concerned with swift takedown of child exploitation and intimate image abuse, and making that an overly bureaucratic process. I think before it was this idea of a tribunal, it was a bit pointless. So I like the narrow focus of that. The last point I might make is about this idea of safety by design. It's interesting, Amara, you mentioned the idea that it doesn't cover algorithms, and that I was rereading the legislation trying to figure that out, because I think that, you know, there's a clear safety by design element to the children's provisions. And it is less clear to me when it comes to the digital safety plans for all the other types of content, like terrorist content and extremist content and hate speech. I think it's built in to the extent that a commission can develop regulations and codes of practice about what's in a digital safety plan and what exposes people to harmful content, which is sort of the metric in the legislation, is going to be driven by algorithms. So I think that will be developed by a commission. But I think a case could be made that should be explicit in the legislation, that there is oversight for algorithmic accountability. I'm curious, though, how this will interact with the potential new AI Act. I mean, one of the things that, they've made explicit in the discussion points about this through ISED was that this would cover the AI content moderation systems, AI systems on platforms. And I know I had advised at the time in conversations with ISED, I said, you should not have the AI Act separately looking at social media platforms and then a separate online harms regulator, because in my view, a social media platform is an AI ecosystem. So if you're really dealing with online harms, you are covering algorithms. That is going to be a key part of what the Online Harms Commission deals with. So I don't right now see how that interacts. I wonder if that language was specific to dance around the different roles of these bodies, but that's actually a very practical issue that they're going to have to work out. And I think there's a really important role here for the proposed digital, whatever the name is, the commission, I'll just call it. So I'll leave it there. Maybe I'll kick it to you, Taylor, to ask some of the start with the
You're not
question.
saying that two departments in government weren't perfectly coordinating their legislative development, are you? Like, I'm shocked if that's
Dare
what
I
you're
say
implying.
that?
Yes. But look, I remember when the AI Act was
Little
first
wrinkles.
tabled, when ADA was added C-27, and we had just finished the panel, right? And I remember it being like somewhat of a surprise that there was a risk assessment mandate within ADA that seemed very similar and potentially overlapping with a risk assessment mechanism that was being talked about through the panel that is now here, right? So there is a conflict, no question, or a tension anyway between those two.
Can I just ask a quick?
Yeah, of course.
Sorry.
Yeah, jump in.
Just to go on your earlier point about the bots and so on, is the way I read that section, I was a bit confused because it seems to there seems to also be a discussion early on in the bill about platforms do not have to kind of actively monitor what's going on their own platforms in terms of content, right? And like they don't have to kind of continuously vacuum up information and study it on their own unless it's flagged, which is kind of what I thought it said. But then I'm like, how would you monitor the bots and amplification if you weren't also doing that? Is it just I don't know.
It's a very good
I don't know
question.
if
Unless it's a known risk. I mean, I suppose if it's a known risk or a flagged risk by
Right.
the commission, a code of practice could be that you need to monitor for this kind of thing, or, you know, like I could imagine that being a requirement of a risk assessment.
Yeah.
Well, you know, but I think that I think it's a major issue, and it's the issue that the DSA and the e-commerce directive always danced around, right? Where it said, because they always had this provision that there's no general duty to monitor, right? So they're like, we don't even want to incentivize an entire system of surveillance. And then it led to all these cases where they were like, well, in specific cases, sometimes you need to monitor to like keep down specific content. And I think that in practice, there is going to be some tension here about how you do it, because how do you flag that content if you're not looking for it? How do you differentiate what they're really concerned about general systems of monitoring versus that? I mean, maybe it's just seen as more specific. It's that specific monitoring that they kind of cut that line, thread that line in the EU.
I mean, I think this is a place where platform practice is interesting because bot identification doesn't typically look at the content itself, right? To decide what is this? Is this true, false, harmful or not, right? It's looking at patterns around account creation, how different accounts interact, et cetera, right? So it's a computational approach usually to identifying the bots. However, I think it's an interesting point, right? A larger point about how all of this gets interpreted over time. What's the practice that develops, right? And then what will the enforcement ultimately be around those kinds of provisions?
And that's where I think
maybe just to,
go
sorry.
ahead. No, jump in, Heidi, please.
Yeah, I was just going to jump off of Vivek's point and say, you know, this leads me back to discussions a couple of years ago about how did you deal with things like disinformation, and some arguments and frameworks that said, okay, you can think about an ABC in this case, you know, actors, behavior, content, and this is less about the C, the content, and more about the actors and behavior. And so that, but again, that has to be clarified, I think, because otherwise you end up with a digital safety plan where in order to find the needle in the haystack, you're monitoring the haystack. And I would say this is also a big discussion in the EU as well around terrorist content, when there was questions about how quickly that would be taken down, whether that would inadvertently lead to general monitoring, even though there was a provision against general monitoring. So this is, I think, something that has to be fleshed out a little bit. And maybe one final thing to say about that is, of course, the companies themselves sometimes leave themselves open to these questions by saying things in their reports like, we have identified 99% of X content, which always leads to the question, well, how do you know it was 99% unless you've surveyed everything? And so I think in a way, companies' rhetoric, ironically, has opened the door to some perhaps overinflated expectations of what can be achieved.
I could just build on Heidi's point. You said the word audit, and it's interesting that the transparency provisions here do not come paired with an audit requirement, as we see in the DSA, right? And there's a very vibrant conversation right now as to, well, how do we implement that? As far as I can see, it is going to be the new commission that will be the recipient of the transparency or the plans and, you know, the reporting by the companies, without any necessary level of assurance, right? And I think this is something else that would be nice to see in the, as we sort of have committee consideration, refining some of that. And I think there's also a nice potential here for some harmonization substantively, right? Harmonization is not necessarily a value in itself, but there are things that are happening in Europe that we could build upon to achieve our legislative aims as well.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, that alignment of obligation and particularly reporting requirements between the DSA, the Online Safety Act in the UK, and this, should it come to be, is really important, because even just for compliance, we should be asking similar things, if not exactly the same. Like, it doesn't make sense for companies to have to do radically different risk assessments with different measures across different jurisdictions. I mean, that seems like a compliance barrier we wouldn't benefit from putting up unless there's really good reason for it in a national context. But look, let me start with add a question to change directions a little bit here, which is on which platforms are included in this, because this is something we did talk a fair amount about on the panel, and like, how do we scope inclusion in this kind of regime? What they landed on was large social media platforms social media defined as the ability of a single user to post to a potentially infinite number of users, which is kind of a clever definition, I think. And live streaming as well that qualifies for that, and adult content that allows for the posting of user-generated content, and a potential discretionary category of high-risk platforms. What do we think this is going to include? Is this the right way of capturing obligation? Heidi, do you want to jump in? I know you know the GSA inclusion criteria really well, and like, how does it align with what's done? And
Yes, I mean, I guess at least in this bill, we've avoided acronyms like VLOP.
yeah, which
Very
was
large
very
online
unfortunate. Yeah.
platforms, or VLOs, however people want to define it. So, at least we've done that. We've avoided awkward acronyms. I think it's interesting that this bit has still been left a bit undefined. And I guess my question is also, what are going to be the criteria for high risk? And maybe a bit like Vivek's point about inspections, knowing a little bit more about, is this, like when you have a child, you say you've got one more time and otherwise X is going to happen. What is going to be the thing that leads to high risk? And I say that because in the questions around the administrative monetary penalties, it actually gets very specific about here's going to be the time when you're going to have an amped up penalty. And so I wondered if there's going to be, maybe in committee discussion, what are going to be the things that are really the criteria for high risk? What are going to be the kinds of reporting that, maybe just as a sort of side note on that, one of the things that surprised me about the bill, or that I'm still thinking through, is actually how small the commission is, given all that it's supposed to be doing. When I look at the UK and the amount that Ofcom got stocked up with people, it was not a 3 to 5 person commission. And so I'm wondering how this is all going to happen with such a
Well, we don't know
small...
how big that office is. It doesn't say.
That's the
and
question.
Ofcom hired 300 people before the bill was
Exactly.
even passed. So that's probably the kind of scale.
I think the CBC was saying something about 300 to 400 people also.
Oh, really? I didn't see that.
Because
okay, yeah, that makes sense.
They had called somebody and they got that number, which is huge. But yeah, the 3 to 5 people struck me as kind of not big enough also. But.
It did strike me. It said the digital safety office could be anywhere, and I wondered if they might build it out of the Child Protection Center in Winnipeg and some of that expertise. I just was curious whether, because my assumption was it's Ottawa based, but then I thought, well, maybe it's not going to be. Maybe it's going to be somewhere else in Canada, because that's such a specific provision. It did strike me too that commission, like the 3 to 5 commissioners, one of the big debates with Bill C-27 was the expertise of, for example, tribunal members, and then certain number had to have expertise in the area, and so many of us were arguing, actually, you should have, like, everyone in the tribunal should have expertise. But that's not mentioned when it comes to this digital with the commission. And I mean, I think it should be explicit in the legislation that it has to be people who have expertise in this area. I mean, there's many people that do, and so they should be drawing from that. Otherwise, you risk I mean, it could be someone who's just a human rights expert, for example, which is important, but doesn't understand the digital dimensions of this and so on.
Amarnath, can I push you on the platform inclusion bit too? I mean, you know more than any of us about potentially non-widely used high-risk platforms and the kinds of harms that exist on them. What could you think could be included in that sort of added high-risk category, and why?
Well, I mean, this always pops up, and I think we talked about it quite a bit in the committee meetings or the advisory board meetings. Is what do we do with the Gabs of the world, the Truth Socials of the world, who I would say qualify as very large platforms now, and are entirely sometimes hate speech oriented, conspiracy theory oriented, extremism oriented. That it doesn't qualify in the same sense as incitement often, but I don't know what the role, that was actually going to be one of my questions to you guys, is what do we do with these other platforms which are potentially speaking to an infinite number of people, but also have zero concern about trust and safety internally, and were actually created with the explicit purpose of having an alternative universe outside of these kind of trust and safety issues that Facebook and others have to deal with. and what do you do about compliance with them, right? Because I think what's happening in Canada, particularly in the extremism space, is a lot of people are spending the entirety of their time on in these ecosystems and not necessarily on some of these more mainstream platforms. And a lot of the hate speech is coming out of there, not necessarily, you know, on Twitter or something. So I don't know what how this legislation deals with this kind of entire ecosystem now, which is very large and influential.
Yeah. And to
I
note,
thought
it
it
doesn't
was
include IP blocking for non-compliance, unlike S210, which does, right? So they clearly avoided the complexities of that. But it does raise the question of what you do when ultimately it's a foreign platform that is completely not complying. Sorry.
Well, and no, and I think one of the issues that just I remember I was always of the view that it was problematic on the DSA that they were really just targeting the large platforms, because I thought all of them should have put in place some risk management obligations. They might be more graduated, but there should be risk management in general. But that's a compliance issue when you're looking at this being taken on by some sort of regulatory body. It's interesting here, though. I think it's quite unique globally to have a provision where they can just, identify high risk platforms. But the criteria on that would have to be so carefully written and constrained. Otherwise, you're going to have what? I mean, who identifies? I can't remember who it is. Is it the governor and council or the commission? So I'm not sure who has oversight of that, but it would have to be so clear. Otherwise, you're just randomly naming platforms. And I mean, it's that issue of information hopping, right? And I think, Amar, you've talked about this, about that fomenting hate happens in the alternative sites and can jump to the mainstream ones. And, you know, we saw with the trucker convoy that, you know, if you're kicked off of YouTube, they were just hopping to the alt YouTubes. And so those smaller platforms do matter a great deal. And, you know, maybe this is starting narrow now because you really need to establish these bodies, but those threats are still out there. I wonder if, should we move on to another question for time? I mean, one of the ones I wanted to ask everybody was, you know, the duty specifically of these platforms. You know, are the digital safety plans that they're looking, the risk management obligations, I mean, is it covering the things that we want to actually be covered, or is more needed? And there have been a few discussions of this, but it would be important to tease out, like, at the end of this, what exactly is the compliance, you know, requirements of a platform, and is that something that we think is going to be effective to actually reduce harm? I will say that one of the things that I had hoped to see in the bill, and that is not there, is specific obligations when it comes to digital safety plans that these companies have to account for and report for how they are respecting or promoting fundamental rights. And that is not present in there. It's very much focused on harm reduction. And it does say, well, they can account for it. And I don't think that's enough. I think we have to force the companies to think through the lens of privacy and freedom of expression and so on. So anyone who maybe wants to jump in on that particular one, you know, maybe I'll start with Vivek, because I know that you and I had pushed a lot on this idea of fundamental rights being so important for company responsibilities. But there are other points.
So, I mean, I completely agree with you. It is interesting that the bill itself, right, in its sort of preambulatory language, and at several points, as Taylor mentioned, around sort of graduated balance that it strikes between free expression and other interests, takes that into account, but we don't see it in the safety plan provisions specifically. I think the other thing I would say is that, you know, I guess it's section 62 of the bill that says what's in the safety plan. It says, you know, there's a residual provision, anything else that's specified by regulations. And I think this is sort of another area where there could be some improvement. So I think it's important, in view of the discussions we had around ADA, you know, so much was left to regulations. Like, even what's a high risk system was left undefined. That's been amended. Some illustrative examples. But I think what I would like to see here is the development of some process, right? And there are provisions here that allow for the commission to develop codes of conduct. And I think this would be a very important place to see different kinds of stakeholders being able to provide input as to what the plan needs to be, and for there to be, continuous learning process, right? That, here's the safety plan year one, this went well, this didn't go well. So it's tying it back to the transparency and assessment provisions too, right? And that's maybe I haven't read it enough and fully, imbibed it, but I didn't on my first reading see that was there. So I'd like to see that built out, right? And I think that's very important to making sure that we do achieve the aims of the bill in the long term.
Yeah, maybe if I can just jump in on that. I mean, I think part of that is because only once you see some of the safety plans are you going to know what's missing or what's not. So I agree on the question of the protection of fundamental rights. But I remember when there was the German NetzdG, the network enforcement law, and the first transparency reports came out, and then I did an analysis of them. All sorts of things became much clearer to me once I had specific examples about the kinds of questions that simply could not be answered by those plans. And that's in part because no matter how detailed you get, I mean, unless it's really sort of fill in the blanks, companies are going to be interpreting what these plans mean. And so once you actually see them, it gives you a better sense of, here's the things we can understand from it. Here's the things we can't understand. Here's the way maybe in which these numbers are tremendously flawed. Or in other cases in the EU, for example, before the DSA, when you had attempts to look at codes of practice, there were things like looking at specific 6-week periods and reasons why that actually wasn't particularly helpful. That was much clearer once you saw that. And so I would agree, some sort of iterative learning within this, that's not just the act itself being reviewed every 5 years, which is part of what's foreseen there, is it's reviewed every 5 years, but something like the safety plans require a bit of a greater agility perhaps. And that's where, just as a side note, I see the role of researchers and of experts continuing, right? Partly because we use these for research purposes and not necessarily always just for policy purposes. That gives you, I think, a bit of a side glance on what these reports are doing, because researchers ask different questions of them that could then inform the next iteration.
Amarnath, do you want to jump on that one too, on the obligations?
No, I don't think I have much to add on that one. But
is it okay if I jump back for a second, Amar? Because I one thing I'd been curious about is I had thought that maybe you would have the view that private messaging should be included, or that gaming should be included, because they were such key attack vectors, especially in the extremism space. So I had been hoping today to kind of poke you on that one and ask your thoughts, because I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised that, the challenge is, of course, the privacy concerns. I mean, a lot of what we're seeing now is, the chat functions within gaming platforms are hugely important for a lot of recruitment and things that are going on. But how do you actually monitor that and without violating a whole bunch of things is the challenge, I think. And I know a lot of these groups know that, and so that's why these things have become, that's why these parts have become kind of influential for recruitment. But I don't know how you get into that legislatively without creating a whole lot of problems. But I do think, WhatsApp groups, Discord, all of these things are hugely important, not just for kind of far right content, but Hindu nationalist content, a lot of anti-Muslim and anti-Semitic content floats around these spaces, and none of them are really touched by the legislation. So I do think part of that is,
sorry.
I do think part of that is that there is a kind of undercurrent of, let's try to get this thing passed, right? Because even listening to the minister talk, I think they've been very strategic about what they've included and how they talk about these things, with the intent of trying to make this a smooth transition. So that also limits, I think, what has been included. And so the CBC did something interesting. They control F'd children on the first bill, and then they control F'd children on this bill. And in the first bill, there was 0 mention of children, and there's 18 mentions of children in this one. And even that's a kind of interesting kind of political strategy, right? Of of how do we try to get this through without too many hiccups.
Yeah. That's kind of where I want to go in this, and we've about 10 minutes left here, but Vivek, you mentioned the powers being placed in the hands of a new regulator, ultimately, a commission and attached bodies. I wonder what you all think about how the politics of this are going to play out, and the proposal for what is ultimately, I mean, a significant regulatory body being stood up in the current political moment that we're in. And I agree with you, Amarnath. I think there's going to be a real push to pass this as quickly as possible, clearly, and they may have the support to do it. But like, how's the politics of this going to play out? And is this, even though there might be similar regulators in other jurisdictions, is there an appetite for that here at the moment? Vivek, do you want to start on that?
Yeah, I'm precisely the wrong person to ask.
No, I believe you're the right person to ask. That's why I started with you.
Okay, let me offer a couple of preliminary thoughts. I mean, I think politics are hard because, I mean, we live in a polarized moment, right? Internationally around these issues. I think it is interesting to me to see where the conservatives have come on, was it S210? I can't remember the number now, the aid verification bill.
Yeah.
So there's an astute aspect to the framing here in terms of child protection and the focus on a limited number of harms, although I know that the leader of opposition has been skeptical. In terms of standing up a new regulatory agency and the politics of that, I think that's also clearly an attack point, right? That, there's going to be more bureaucrats looking at your speech. And that's a simple line of attack. And it's a minority government. I don't know what the larger political calculations are of the government and of the opposition party on this space. But just going back to sort of the institutional structure, I think it's interesting to see that we've landed at this idea of, or this bill lands on the idea of yet another regulator, right? Our cousins in the UK are vesting a lot of this power in Ofcom, right? Their CRTC. And, a lot of the algorithmic regulation that they're enacting is with their privacy commissioner, essentially, right? So you have two larger bodies of expertise. So I wonder if there's, returns to scale. But I think the politics are really challenging. I think, the citizens, the coordinate body, I can't remember what was called, the Citizens Assembly, right? Found that there was, if you talk to ordinary people, a broad appetite to do something about this, especially on children, right? Because there's a feeling that kids are online and being exposed to all kinds of terrible stuff. So I think I'm an optimist. I'm optimistic that we can hopefully have a sensible conversation on this.
Heidi, what do you think about how this is going to play out this week?
Yeah, I mean, it's been interesting just to even see the Conservatives shift a little bit on what they've been saying about the bill, even over the course of the last few days, from the sort of initial rejection pre even seeing the bill to, I think, something that's a more nuanced, whatever you want to call it, something that says like, no, we recognize this is a problem. We just think there are other ways of solving it. And so I wonder, as the debate continues, what will happen. I'll maybe say as an aside, one of the things that's interesting to observe elsewhere, like in the UK, is that this is a process wholly led by the Conservatives. So it's not actually the case that in all instances, it's obvious who stands on which side of whether something should be done. And so to me, what that means is there's potential, right? At the moment, the Conservatives may be more aligned with, I'm not quite sure who, because also in the US, things are moving tremendously with the question of what's going to happen before the Supreme Court. And that's all coming out of Republican states. So it's wholly possible that the Conservatives change their mind in different ways, looking at other jurisdictions who have been invested in these kinds of questions, particularly, for example, the Conservatives in the UK. So I see this as one where there's going to be a lot of debate. I suspect maybe even more debate around the criminal code stuff that we haven't delved into today. So one world I could foresee is that's where the real sort of rubber hits the road in terms of debate, and where a lot of things get changed, and that actually that there comes to be more substantial agreement and maybe understanding about the comparative narrowness of the takedown parts of this bill. And I say that perhaps some of the initial reaction is also maybe a hangover from one of the previous false starts, right? A sort of impression that this is just a version 2 that looks very similar, but perhaps as there's more reporting, as Amar points out, this is actually a very, very different bill, and maybe that's going to also become clearer and clearer as this goes through. This is not just 2021 Redux. It actually looks radically different in its sort of philosophy and foundation and underpinnings.
Yeah. Your point about where conservatives more broadly defined line up on these issues it's complicated, because in the UK and Australia, both regulatory regimes were designed and implemented and passed by conservative governments, and DSA was supported by many conservative governments across Europe, obviously. And so this isn't necessarily a binary left-right discussion. And I think, Vivek, you're right with what the conservatives now supporting C10, which in many ways is a far more, has some provisions in it that are potentially more intrusive than what's in this, shows that there's maybe a little more flexibility in our ideological positions on this than was previously sort of suspected. Right?
Yeah,
I'm not no, go ahead. Yeah.
I think this is where the Criminal Code and Human Rights Act amendments become politically problematic, right? I think.
So let's talk about that for a second. Do you want to give a quick reflection? I know that wasn't the focus of this.
So I think the Criminal Code amendment would basically make it a crime to violate any act of Parliament with hate as a motive, subject to life imprisonment. That's an extraordinarily overbroad provision. It's a crime in Canada to refuse a seed inspector from the Agricultural Service to come and look at your seeds if you're a farmer. If you're motivated by hate, well, guess what? Life in prison could be in your future, right? That's just not really a well thought out amendment, I think.
They just need to delete that entire provision.
Yeah, I think that would be very sensible. On the Human Rights Act, this reinstates the Section 13, which basically makes it a discriminatory practice to engage in, let's call it hateful expression. And subjects you to that process. And that was extraordinarily controversial in the early 2000s, right, which led to the Stephen Harper government repealing it in 2012 or 2013. So I think the politics there are also really hard.
I think the politics are really hard on both, and especially on Section 13, although I think that, and this leans back to something Heidi had said about the complexity of this legislation. So like even in reintroducing Section 13, it is written so much more narrowly than the previous provision, which was basically exposing you to hatred and contempt. And it's using the Walcott standard, the Supreme Court standard that is really high about disdain and vilification. That's basically just delegitimizing an entire group of people. And so it's actually relatively narrow, but there could be really important conversations about how do you ensure that threshold is the focus of a tribunal. How do you ensure that there are limits and just not overwhelming a tribunal? I mean, but what speaks to what Heidi said is it is a complex bill, and the ways that maybe they try to minimize overwhelming that body are steps like, if it's evident that it's not hatred, it can be dismissed so that a body is not overwhelmed. Fundamental rights are dealt with at key incremental points. Little provisions like there's no duty to monitor generally. So it's actually asking a lot of us to really carefully understand how those details interact, because that is what will ultimately make for a balanced discussion. And in the political environment we're in, that's a lot to ask for that isn't necessarily playing out. So, except here, of course. But I think that's going to be one of the most challenging aspects going forward.
Yeah. All right, look, we're coming up to the hour. We are going to have another conversation just on that in the coming weeks, because I do think that's going to be, we both think it's going to be a part of this big debate, clearly. But maybe just as a final round the table, what are you going to be watching for as this debate unfolds over the coming month or two? If we're to regroup in 2 months, what do you think you will have seen in this debate, or what you'll be watching for in it? Amar, do you want to go first, and then we'll go around back to it?
Sure. I mean, yeah, I do think we'll see some debate around it. I mean, the Polyev government already, I think it was in the before it even came out, said, you know, hate speech is everything that Justin Trudeau hates, right? So I do think that that kind of language is going to be part of this debate, unfortunately. But I'll be looking forward to kind of looking at how the online world responds, how the far right responds, how the extremism spaces respond. I know the NDP was saying that they have some issues that they want to deal with at the parliamentary committee stage, and so yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see how this progresses, because it's going to be a long road probably until the end of the year.
Yeah. Heidi, you want to go next?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to just keep monitoring to see how much is this a politics conversation, how much is this a policy conversation? Because we've actually had a bit of both right now, which I would say I've been pleasantly surprised by, that it actually has been a little bit of both. So where is the balance landing on those two things? And hopefully we're going to keep having policy discussion alongside the more kind of political stuff as well.
Vivek?
Yeah, I think I'm really going to be watching what the Conservatives will do here, right? How they're going to triangulate on this bill, both in sort of the current acrimonious environment, but, you know, we have a 3-term government. So I think there's a lot of interesting political calculations. I'm also really interested to see what the formal response of the platforms is going to be. It's been interesting in the United States around the child protection bill that's in the Senate right now, that big tech is starting to come around to it. And again, there's bipartisanship in Congress, quite rare, because everyone can sort of agree that we need to do something to protect kids. And I think that's a sort of powerful driver that can transcend some of those political divides, as you know, many of you have mentioned.
Emily, do you want to?
I think one of the things I'm looking for is I'm curious about how discussions of freedom of expression evolve. You know, I was concerned that the conservative position was we should just criminalize all this and like criminalize cyberbullying. I'm like, you're going to throw children in jail for cyberbullying? That's not a good idea. And but then on the other side, there are some really important, you know, and legitimate criticisms of this bill. So how receptive is the federal government going to be to those criticisms to improve it? I mean, what I would hope is that we see everyone show up to talk about it, about ways to improve it. That would be my hope. But so far we are getting a mix, as Heidi says, but we'll see if that holds, because if veers too much into the politics, everyone's just going to stand their ground, and this bill won't be improved.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate that to close, which is, I mean, one thing I would ask that is which committee this is going to end up in, because that might have something to do with the tone. And if we go back to heritage, I mean, it might be that some of the debates and the battle lines of C11 and 18 sort of revisit here, which would be unfortunate, I think. And maybe going to justice is a chance to kind of reset the discourse, the political discourse, as this moves through committee. And I share the same hope as Emily here, that like the government can be a little bit more open to concerns and critiques and amendments than they were with those 2 previous digital bills, and a little less intransigent, and that opposition parties maybe engage with the core of what this does and doesn't do. Yeah, I hope both those things are possible, but we'll see. But thank you all for joining us, both in the audience and to our panelists. We're gonna keep having these conversations and hope you can join us in the coming weeks as this bill works its way through our government. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.